Between school and work, there were 15 minutes on foot. She vanished in that window. What the driver saw changed everything 17 years later. She walked the same route every morning, down Maple Street where the sidewalk cracked in 3 places she had memorized, past the blue house with the wind chimes that never stopped moving, even on still days, and then left onto Harrison where the crossing guard still stood even though most of the kids were old enough now to cross alone. Her backpack hung from one shoulder, the way everyone wore them that year, and inside were the same things most days: 3 notebooks with bent corners, a graphing calculator she shared with her younger brother, a hairbrush, a pack of gum she kept hidden in the small front pocket where teachers never looked. Her name was Ordinary, the kind of name that appeared on classroom rosters without anyone pausing to ask how to pronounce it. She sat in the middle rows, turned in her assignments on time, and spoke when called on but rarely volunteered. Teachers wrote things like pleasant and conscientious on her report cards. She had friends, the kind you sit with at lunch and talk to between classes, though no one would have called her the center of any group. She laughed at the right moments and knew when to stay quiet. She belonged to the landscape of that school, the way a tree belongs to a yard, noticed only in its absence. After school on most days she worked. The job had started the summer before, a part-time position at a small shop downtown that sold cards and gifts and candles that smelled like artificial vanilla. The owner was a woman in her 50s who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and sometimes let her leave early if the store was empty. She learned to work the register, to wrap presents in tissue paper with the edges folded just so, to restock shelves in a specific order that made sense only to the owner. The work was easy and forgettable, the kind that filled time without demanding much of her. She saved most of what she earned in a checking account her mother had helped her open, though she didn't have specific plans for the money. It simply accumulated, a small growing number she checked sometimes on the receipts the ATM printed. Her family lived in a 2-story house with aluminum siding that had faded from white to a kind of gray that happened so slowly no one thought to paint over it. Her father worked long shifts, the kind of job that meant he left before sunrise and came home after dinner was cold. Her mother kept the house running with a quiet efficiency: groceries, laundry, bills paid on time, a calendar on the refrigerator marked with everyone's schedules in different colored pens. There was a younger brother who played video games in the basement, and a dog that slept on the couch, even though it wasn't supposed to. The house smelled like whatever had been cooked the night before and the detergent her mother bought in bulk from the warehouse store. She ate breakfast most mornings at the kitchen counter, cereal or toast, sometimes nothing if she woke up late. Her mother tried to make her sit at the table but had stopped insisting years ago. They talked about small things: what time she'd be home, whether she needed lunch money, if she'd finished her homework. The conversations were short and functional, the kind that happen between people who see each other every day and assume there will always be another morning to say more. On weekends, she sometimes went to the movies with friends or walked around the mall without buying much of anything. She had a cell phone, one of the flip ones that everyone had started carrying, though service was spotty and she didn't use it often. Most communication still happened in person, or through the house phone, the one with the long cord that stretched into the hallway if you wanted privacy. She talked to a few friends regularly, conversations about homework and boys and plans that usually didn't materialize into anything concrete. There was no one she told everything to, no diary hidden under her mattress, no secret life that diverged dramatically from what everyone saw. She had wanted to learn to drive, had studied the manual her father gave her and talked about getting her permit, but something always delayed it: scheduling the test, finding time for practice, the cost of insurance her parents mentioned vaguely as something they'd need to figure out. So she still walked most places, or caught rides when she could. The town was small enough that walking was normal, expected even. People knew each other, recognized cars, waved from porches. It was the kind of place where doors stayed unlocked during the day, and kids rode bikes without helmets, and no one thought much about it. Her routines had calcified over years into patterns she barely noticed. She knew which teachers gave surprise quizzes, and which ones showed movies on Fridays. She knew the cashier at the grocery store who always asked how school was going, and the librarian who recommended books without being asked. She knew the rhythm of seasons in that town, when the leaves would turn, when the first snow would close school, when spring would come late and muddy. She moved through it all with the ease of someone who had never lived anywhere else, who assumed that life would continue to unfold in more or less the same way, that the future would be a gradual extension of the present, slightly different, but not unrecognizable. Her aspirations, when anyone asked, were modest and unformed. She thought maybe she'd go to the community college an hour away, or maybe find full-time work after graduation. She liked children and had mentioned once that teaching might be nice, or nursing, or something that involved helping people. But these were notions rather than plans, the kind of answers teenagers give when adults ask what they want to be, knowing the question is mostly ceremonial. The truth was, she hadn't decided, hadn't felt the urgency to decide. She was 17, and 17 still felt like a place where time stretched out generously ahead. She had no enemies that anyone knew of, no ex-boyfriend who called too much, no fights that escalated beyond the ordinary friction of teenage social life. She didn't drink or use drugs, didn't sneak out at night or skip school. She wasn't rebellious or troubled or withdrawn. She was, by every visible measure, fine, normal. The kind of teenager parents hope for, the kind who doesn't require intervention or worry, who moves through adolescence without crisis. And so the days continued, one after another, each so similar to the last that they blurred together into a single continuous experience of showing up, doing what was expected, going home. She woke and dressed and walked to school. She sat in classes and ate lunch and walked to work. She came home and ate dinner and did homework and went to bed. The pattern repeated with only minor variations, the way a song plays with the same melody but different small inflections each time. It was a life that felt permanent in its ordinariness, as though it had always been this way and always would be. No one watching her would have thought to worry. No one watching her would have seen anything ending. The afternoon was warm for late September, the kind of warmth that arrives unexpectedly after cooler days and makes people leave their jackets in their lockers. She had worn a sweatshirt that morning but had taken it off by third period, tying it around her waist the way she always did. The school day ended at 2:45, the bell ringing through hallways already emptying, students pushing through double doors into sunlight that made them squint. She had said goodbye to a friend near the main entrance, a brief exchange about homework or a test. Nothing anyone would remember as significant. The friend watched her walk toward the parking lot, then turned the other direction toward her own ride home. It was the kind of parting that happened every day, so ordinary that it dissolved from memory almost immediately. She should have been at work by 3:30. The shop was a 15-minute walk from school, a route she had taken dozens of times, down 2 blocks, across the intersection with the 4-way stop, past the pharmacy and the insurance office and the hair salon that always smelled like chemicals and shampoo. The owner expected her at 3:30 on Tuesdays and Thursdays, sometimes Fridays if it was busy. She was scheduled that day. Her name was written on the calendar behind the register in the owner's neat handwriting. By 4 o'clock, the owner noticed she hadn't arrived. It wasn't unusual for teenagers to run late, to get distracted, or forget to check the time. The owner called the house phone, let it ring 8 times before hanging up. No one was home yet. Her mother was still at her own job, her father on his route, her brother at a friend's house or somewhere in the neighborhood. The owner tidied the counter, helped 2 customers, glanced at the door each time it opened. By 4:30, she called again. The phone rang into emptiness. Her mother arrived home a little after 5, the time she always came through the door with grocery bags or her purse and the stack of mail she grabbed from the box at the end of the driveway. She set everything on the kitchen counter and noticed the quietness. The dog greeted her, but the house had that hollow feeling of being unoccupied. She called out anyway, her daughter's name echoing up the stairs and getting no response. It wasn't concerning yet. Teenagers had lives that extended beyond the routes their parents knew. Maybe she had gone to a friend's house after school. Maybe plans had changed. Her mother started dinner, the mechanical process of boiling water and opening cans and setting the table for 4. She expected everyone home by 6. That was the unspoken rule. Dinner at 6, everyone present unless arrangements had been made ahead of time. By 5:30, the owner called the house again. This time her mother answered, and there was a brief conversation that started casual and ended with a new quality of attention. She hadn't been to work. The owner had been calling. Her mother thanked her, said she'd figure it out, hung up, and stood in the kitchen with her hand still on the receiver. She tried her daughter's cell phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail, the generic automated voice that meant she hadn't recorded her own greeting. Her mother left a message, kept her tone light. "Honey, just checking where you are. Call me back." She called 2 friends whose numbers she had written in the address book she kept in the drawer by the phone. The first girl answered and said she'd seen her at school, said goodbye to her after last period, assumed she'd gone to work. The second friend said almost the same thing. No one had made plans with her. No one had seen her after school ended. Her mother called her husband at work, caught him during a break. She explained that their daughter hadn't come home, hadn't gone to work, wasn't answering her phone. He said the things that made sense to say, that she was probably fine, probably at a friend's house they didn't know about, probably her phone had died. He said he'd be home soon. He said not to worry yet. But the worry had already started, a small, cold feeling that lived somewhere behind the sternum and grew slowly, the way ice spreads across a windshield. Her mother went upstairs to her daughter's room, as if she might find some clue there, some note or calendar entry that explained the absence. The room looked exactly as it always did. The bed was made, more or less. Clothes were folded on a chair. The desk had textbooks stacked in a precarious pile, and a cup of pens and a phone charger plugged into the wall with nothing attached to it. Everything was in its place. Nothing had been packed or taken. Her toothbrush was still in the bathroom. Her father came home before 6. They made more calls together, working through the short list of people their daughter might be with. They called the shop again, though they knew she hadn't shown up. They called the school and got the after-hours voicemail. They debated whether to call the police and decided it was too soon, that she would walk through the door any minute and they would feel foolish for panicking. Dinner sat on the table, untouched. Her brother came home and asked where she was, and her mother said they didn't know yet, said it in a voice that tried to sound normal, but didn't quite manage it. The 3 of them sat in the living room, the television on, but no one watching it. Every few minutes, her mother tried the cell phone again. It rang and went to voicemail. She left another message, and then another, her voice tightening each time. By 8 o'clock, they called the police. The dispatcher took the information with a calmness that felt wrong. A 17-year-old girl, last seen leaving school at 2:45, expected at work at 3:30, never arrived, not answering her phone, no history of running away. The dispatcher said an officer would come to the house, said it with the efficiency of someone who had taken this kind of call before. They waited, the 3 of them, not speaking much, each running through the same small catalogue of possibilities, none of which felt adequate. The officer arrived a little before 9. He was young, probably not much older than 30, and he sat in their living room with a notepad and asked questions in a voice that was professional and kind. He asked for a description, height, weight, hair color, what she'd been wearing. Her mother tried to remember and couldn't say for certain. A sweatshirt, jeans maybe. Or was it a skirt? The officer wrote everything down. He asked if she had a boyfriend, if there had been any arguments, any unusual behavior, anything at all that seemed different. They said no to everything. He asked for a recent photograph. Her mother went upstairs and came back with a picture from the previous spring, a school photo with a neutral background, her daughter smiling the way students smile for these portraits, polite and a little awkward. The officer looked at it for a moment, then placed it carefully in a plastic sleeve. He said they would start looking tonight, said they would check with hospitals and talk to friends and retrace her likely routes. He said most missing teenagers come home on their own within 24 hours. He said it the way people say reassuring things they've been trained to say. After he left, the house filled with a silence that felt different from any silence before it. Her parents stayed awake, moving through rooms without purpose, making tea they didn't drink, turning on lights in every part of the house as if brightness might summon her home. The phone sat on the counter, willing it to ring. Her mother checked her daughter's room again, opened drawers carefully, looking for something she couldn't name. Her father stood at the front window, watching the street for headlights that didn't come. The hours passed slowly, each minute expanding and contracting in ways that made time feel unreliable. Midnight arrived, and then 1, and then 2. The house stayed lit. No one slept. And still the door didn't open. Still the phone didn't ring. Still there was only the absence, growing larger and heavier with every hour that passed, filling the rooms until there was no space left for anything else. By morning, the absence had taken on a different quality. What had been worry in the dark hours became something more solid in daylight, something that required action and organization and the participation of other people. Her father called his work and said he wouldn't be in. Her mother called hers and said the same. Her brother went to school because no one knew what else to do with him, and the house felt wrong with him there, asking questions no one could answer. The police came back, 2 officers this time, and they asked the same questions as the night before, but with more detail, more precision. They wanted to know about her friends, so her mother gave them names and phone numbers from the address book, apologized that she didn't know all of them. The teenagers had whole social worlds their parents only partially glimpsed. They wanted to know about her habits, her roots, where she might go if she wanted to be alone. Her parents struggled to answer. She wasn't secretive, but she also wasn't someone who narrated her every movement. She existed in the spaces between home and school and work, and those spaces now felt vast and unknowable. The officers asked to see her room. They went upstairs and stood in the doorway, looking at the ordinariness of it, the unmade bed, the posters on the walls, the school books, the shoes lined up by the closet. They asked if they could look through her things, and her mother nodded, watched as they opened drawers carefully, looked under the mattress, checked the pockets of jackets hanging in the closet. They were searching for something, though what exactly remained unclear. A note, maybe. A plan. Evidence of intention. They found nothing that suggested she had meant to disappear. Her mother called the shop owner again, asked if she could think of anything unusual from the last time her daughter had worked, any customers who had paid too much attention, any conversations that seemed odd. The owner said no, said everything had been normal, said she wished she had something helpful to offer. Her mother thanked her and hung up and stood in the kitchen, staring at the calendar on the refrigerator where her daughter's work schedule was marked in blue pen. By afternoon, people had started to gather. Neighbors came to the door with casseroles and concern, offering help in the vague way people do when they don't know what help looks like. Friends from school appeared, girls who had known her daughter, who sat on the couch and cried and said they couldn't believe it, couldn't understand it. They told the officers the same things, that she was normal, that nothing had seemed wrong, that they'd said goodbye to her after school and expected to see her the next day. Someone suggested organizing a search. It was a thing people did, a way to convert helplessness into movement. By evening, 30 or 40 people had assembled in the high school parking lot. The police coordinated, divided people into groups, gave each group a section of town to cover. They walked through parks and wooded areas, behind shopping centers, along the roads that led out of town. They called her name into empty spaces and heard nothing back but their own voices. They looked in ditches and ravines, and the places teenagers sometimes went to drink or hide from parents. They found nothing. No sign of her, no discarded backpack, no indication she had passed through any of these spaces. The local news came the next day, a reporter and a cameraman who set up on the front lawn and asked her parents to speak. Her mother stood on the porch and held the school photograph and said her daughter's name and description and begged anyone who had seen her to call the police. Her voice broke once, and the reporter thanked her, and the segment aired that evening during the 6 o'clock broadcast. Tips started coming in after that, phone calls to the police station from people who thought they'd seen something. A girl matching her description at a gas station 2 towns over. A teenager hitchhiking on the highway. A customer at a fast food restaurant who looked similar. Officers followed up on each one. None of them were her. Flyers went up on telephone poles and in shop windows and on bulletin boards at the grocery store and the library. Her face appeared everywhere, smiling that polite school photo smile, with her name and physical description and the phone number for the police tip line printed below. People looked at the flyers and felt the appropriate sadness and fear. And then they continued with their groceries, their errands, their lives. The flyers became part of the landscape, noticed and then invisible, the way missing pet signs eventually fade into the background. Her parents retraced her route from school to the shop, walking it themselves, stopping to ask at every business along the way if anyone had seen her that afternoon. The pharmacy clerk said no. The insurance office was closed. The woman at the hair salon thought maybe she'd seen her walk past the window around 3, but she couldn't be certain, said it might have been a different girl, apologized for not being more help. Every answer led nowhere. Every conversation ended in the same uncertainty. The police interviewed students at the school, pulling kids out of class one by one to ask what they'd seen, what they knew. Most of them had nothing to offer. A few mentioned seeing her in the hallway between classes or in the cafeteria at lunch or walking toward the exit after the final bell. One boy said he'd been in the parking lot and thought he saw her walking toward the street, but he'd been focused on finding his own ride and hadn't paid much attention. The details were vague, the memories already dissolving. No one had noticed anything unusual because there had been nothing unusual to notice. Theories began to circulate in the way they do when facts are scarce. Maybe she had run away, though her parents insisted she had no reason to. Maybe she'd gotten into a car with someone she knew, though no one could say who. Maybe she'd been taken by a stranger, snatched off the street in the brief window between school and work. Each theory felt both possible and inadequate. The police investigated her computer, the slow desktop in the family room that everyone shared. They found nothing alarming, no strange emails, no chat room conversations with suspicious people, no evidence of a secret online life. Her phone records showed calls to friends, to her parents, to the shop. Nothing unexpected. Weeks passed. The searches continued, but with fewer people each time. The news stopped covering it except for brief updates that said little, still missing, no new leads, family still hoping. Her parents stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. They kept her room exactly as it was, as though changing anything might sever some invisible thread that connected them to her. They left the porch light on every night. They kept her cell phone account active, kept calling it even though it went straight to voicemail now, the battery long dead. The school held an assembly. Students sat in the gym and listened to counselors talk about coping with uncertainty, about supporting each other, about not giving up hope. There were candles and songs and a banner that everyone signed with messages of encouragement and love. It was moved to the front office where it hung for months until someone eventually took it down and stored it somewhere, no longer sure what to do with it. People stopped asking her parents for updates. The questions became uncomfortable. The answers always the same. Nothing new, still looking. Thank you for asking. Friends and neighbors withdrew slightly, not out of cruelty, but out of not knowing what to say, how to be around this kind of ongoing grief. The casseroles stopped coming. The phone rang less often. Life in the town returned to its normal rhythms, and her absence became something people acknowledged with sadness when reminded but didn't actively think about otherwise. Her younger brother went back to being a kid who played video games in the basement, though he was quieter now, more careful around his parents. He heard them crying sometimes through the walls at night. He saw the way they looked at her empty chair at dinner. He learned to carry the weight of it without speaking about it, the way children learn to adapt to the incomprehensible. The police kept the case open, but shifted their focus to other matters, other emergencies. An officer would call every few weeks with updates that weren't really updates, still investigating, following leads, haven't forgotten. Her parents believed them and didn't believe them. They understood that their daughter was becoming a file, a cold case, a story without an ending. And still there was no answer. No body found, no confession, no evidence that explained what had happened in those hours after she walked out of school. Just the silence, and the not knowing, and the terrible patience of waiting for something that might never come. The first year was the hardest, because hope still felt like something rational, something that could be maintained through effort and vigilance. Her mother kept a notebook where she wrote down every tip that came in, every possible sighting, every fragment of information that might mean something. She organized the pages by date and cross-referenced them with maps, drawing lines between locations, looking for patterns that never emerged. The notebook filled slowly, then sat on the kitchen counter, then moved to a drawer, then to a closet shelf where it gathered dust alongside other objects that had lost their purpose. Her father went back to work because they needed the income, because sitting at home made the absence more tangible, because movement felt better than stillness, even when the movement led nowhere. He drove his routes and came home and ate dinner and went to bed, and the days were identical except for the growing certainty that his daughter was not coming back. He didn't say this out loud. Neither of them did. But it lived in the house with them, in the way they stopped jumping when the phone rang, in the way they stopped checking the front window every time a car passed. The second year was different. The sharp edge of panic had worn down into something duller and more permanent. Her bedroom door stayed closed most of the time now. Her mother still cleaned it every few weeks, dusting surfaces and vacuuming the carpet, but she did it quickly, efficiently, as though prolonged exposure might break something inside her that was barely holding together. The clothes in the closet became outdated, the styles from 2 years ago that no teenager would wear now. The posters on the walls started to curl at the edges. Her brother grew taller, his voice deepened. He started high school himself. He walked past the flyers of his sister that still hung in a few shop windows, faded now from sun exposure, the ink bleeding slightly from rain that had gotten under the plastic sleeves. He didn't look at them anymore. His friends knew not to mention it. Teachers who had taught both of them handled him carefully, as though he might shatter if addressed too directly. He became good at being normal, at laughing at jokes and doing homework, and pretending his family was like other families. The anniversaries were marked quietly. The first year, then the second, then the third. The local news would run a brief segment. Still missing, family still searching. If you have any information, please call. Her parents would stand on the porch again, older now, their faces lined in ways that hadn't been there before, and they would hold the same photograph and say the same things. Then the cameras would leave, and they would go back inside and sit in the living room without speaking. People in town remembered, but in an abstract way, the way you remember something that happened to someone else, something sad but distant. New families moved in who didn't know the story. Teenagers started at the high school who had never heard her name. The shop where she used to work changed ownership, and the new owner didn't know that a girl who once stood behind that register had vanished. The continuity of ordinary life covered over the rupture she had left. Her parents attended support groups for families of missing people. They sat in circles in church basements and community centers and listened to other parents tell similar stories. Children who had disappeared, investigations that went cold, years of not knowing. Some of the families had found their children eventually, though the endings were rarely happy. Most had not. The groups offered no solutions, only the comfort of being around people who understood that grief without closure was a specific kind of torture. Her mother went regularly for a while, then sporadically, then stopped going. Her father went twice and decided he couldn't bear it. They learned to live around the absence. It became the central fact of their existence, the thing that organized everything else. Holidays were endured rather than celebrated. Birthdays passed with quiet acknowledgement. Her mother baked a cake on her daughter's 18th birthday and set it on the table, and they stared at it until her father finally cut 3 pieces, and they ate in silence. The candles stayed unlit. The police called less frequently. Once a month, then every few months, then only when something tangentially related came up. A body found in another state that didn't match, a lead from an unrelated case that went nowhere. The detective assigned to the case changed twice. The new ones read through the files and made sympathetic noises and promised to keep looking, but her parents could hear the resignation in their voices. The case had gone as far as it could go without new information. There was nothing left to investigate. Her mother sometimes drove to the places her daughter used to go. The school, though she had graduated and moved on. The shop where she used to work. The routes she would have walked. Her mother would sit in the parked car and watch people moving through their lives and wonder if any of them had seen something that day, if any of them held a piece of the answer without knowing it. She never got out. She just sat there until the watching became too painful, then drove home. The internet arrived more fully into their lives, and her mother learned to search for her daughter there. She found a few websites dedicated to missing persons, forums where people discussed cases and shared theories. She read through threads about her daughter, strangers speculating about what might have happened, and the distance between their words and the reality of her daughter. The girl who had sat at their kitchen counter eating cereal, who had tied her sweatshirt around her waist, who had laughed at something her brother said, was unbearable. She stopped reading. Her father aged in visible ways. His hair went grey, then white. He developed a tremor in his left hand. He stopped talking about the future in any concrete terms. When people asked how he was doing, he said fine, and everyone understood that fine meant something different for him than it meant for them. That fine was simply the word you used to end conversations you didn't want to have. Her brother left for college, a state school 3 hours away. He called home once a week and visited on holidays and tried to build a life that wasn't defined entirely by what had happened to his family. He loved his parents and felt guilty for leaving them, guilty for being the child who got to grow up, guilty for sometimes going entire days without thinking about his sister. He majored in something practical and made friends who didn't know his history and felt the relief of being ordinary. By the 5th year, the house had settled into its new reality. The silence was no longer shocking. The empty chair at dinner was simply empty. Her parents had learned to mention her name without breaking down, to talk about her in the past tense without flinching visibly. They had accepted, though they would never have used that word, that she was gone and likely not coming back. They had not accepted that they would never know what happened. That possibility, that they might die without ever knowing, was the thing that kept them awake at night. The town moved on because towns always do. The high school had new students, new dramas, new tragedies that felt immediate and urgent. The shops downtown changed hands, new businesses opened and closed. The roads were repaved, trees grew taller. Babies were born, and old people died, and life continued its relentless forward motion. But in that house on the street with the aluminum siding that had never been repainted, time had stopped on an afternoon in late September. Every clock in every room still measured the hours and days and years, but the measurements were meaningless. Her parents existed in a permanent state of that day, waiting for a phone call or a knock on the door or some resolution that never came. They were trapped in the moment between before and after, suspended in the terrible patience of not knowing. And her room stayed closed, and the porch light stayed on, and the seasons changed outside the windows. And still there was only absence and silence, and the weight of all the questions that had no answers. 17 years had passed when the bus driver mentioned it. He was sitting in a diner on his lunch break, the same diner where he ate most days, ordering the same turkey sandwich and coffee he always ordered. There were 2 other drivers with him, men he'd worked with for years, and they were talking about nothing in particular. Routes, traffic, the weather turning cold earlier than usual. The conversation drifted the way conversations do when people are filling time, and somehow they got onto the subject of memory, how strange it was that certain moments stayed with you while whole years disappeared. The bus driver was in his 50s now, had been driving the same route for nearly 2 decades. He knew every stop, every turn, every pothole in the road. He'd seen thousands of passengers come and go, most of them forgettable, their faces blending together into a general impression of humanity in transit. But he mentioned, almost casually, that sometimes a detail would surface years later, something he'd seen but hadn't registered as important at the time. One of the other drivers asked what he meant, and he shrugged, took a sip of coffee, said there'd been an afternoon years ago. He couldn't remember exactly when, maybe 15 or 16 years back, when he'd seen a girl standing at a corner near the high school. He remembered because she'd looked like she was waiting for something, but when his bus stopped, she didn't get on. She'd been holding a backpack, he thought, or maybe it was just over her shoulder. He'd kept the doors open a few extra seconds, thinking she might change her mind, but she'd stayed on the sidewalk, looking down the street the other direction. He said he wouldn't have thought about it again, except that he'd seen a newspaper article that morning, one of those retrospective pieces that ran on slow news days. Where are they now? Unsolved cases. Mysteries that refuse to close. There'd been a photo, a school picture of a girl who'd disappeared from that same area, and something about the face was familiar. He couldn't be certain it was the same girl he'd seen that afternoon, but the timing felt right, and the location felt right, and the image had been bothering him all morning. The other drivers listened, and one of them asked if he'd called the police about it. The bus driver said he hadn't, said he wasn't even sure it was worth mentioning. It had been so long ago. He might be misremembering. The girl he'd seen might have been someone else entirely. Thousands of kids took his route over the years. But the detail sat with him, uncomfortable and persistent, the way a stone sits in a shoe. By the end of his shift, he'd decided to call. He looked up the non-emergency number for the police department and called from his cell phone in the parking lot of the bus depot, sitting in his car with the engine running. He explained who he was, explained about the article, explained about the memory that might mean nothing. The dispatcher took his information and said someone would call him back. 2 days later, a detective called. Not the original detective from 17 years ago. That man had retired, but someone younger who'd inherited the file. The detective asked him to describe what he'd seen, and the bus driver did his best. A girl at a corner, late afternoon, sunlight coming from the west. She'd been looking down the street as though expecting someone. She'd had a backpack or a bag. She'd been wearing something casual, jeans maybe, or a skirt. He couldn't remember clearly. The detective asked which corner, and he gave the intersection, said he was certain about that part because it was a regular stop on his route. The detective thanked him and said they'd look into it. The bus driver hung up and felt both relieved and foolish. He'd probably wasted everyone's time. The girl he'd seen was likely someone else, someone who'd gotten a ride from a friend or walked home a different way. Still, he'd done what he could. He'd reported what he remembered, vague as it was. The detective pulled the old case file, boxes of documents and photographs and interview transcripts that hadn't been touched in years. He read through the timeline again. She'd last been seen leaving school at 2:45. She'd been expected at work at 3:30. The route between school and the shop took about 15 minutes on foot. The bus driver's regular route passed through that area around 3 o'clock. The timing worked. The detective called the parents, a conversation he'd been trained for, but that never got easier. He explained about the bus driver, about the memory, about the possibility that their daughter had been at that corner waiting for someone. Her mother's voice went quiet on the other end of the line. She asked what it meant. The detective said honestly he didn't know. It was a detail, nothing more. It didn't explain where she'd gone or what had happened to her, but it was something they hadn't known before. Her mother thanked him and hung up and stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where she'd stood 17 years ago waiting for her daughter to come home. She called her husband at work and told him. He said he'd come home early. They sat together at the table and tried to understand what this new information meant. If she'd been at that corner, she'd been moving away from her usual route to work. The shop was in the opposite direction. So either she'd changed her plans, or she'd been meeting someone, or she'd gotten turned around somehow. Her parents tried to think of who she might have been meeting, but the list was impossibly long. A friend from school, someone from work, someone they'd never known about. The possibilities expanded rather than narrowed. The detective reviewed the old interviews, looking for any mention of that intersection. Several students had been asked about their movements that afternoon, but no one had mentioned seeing her there. Either they hadn't been there, or they'd forgotten, or they'd never noticed her in the first place. Memory was unreliable, especially across so many years. The detective knew that the bus driver's recollection might be flawed, might be his mind filling in gaps with assumptions, but it was the first new piece of information in over a decade. He drove to the intersection and stood where the bus driver said he'd seen her. It was a corner like any corner, unremarkable. There was a traffic light, a crosswalk, a gas station on one side and a vacant lot on the other. He tried to imagine what a 17-year-old girl might have been doing there, who she might have been waiting for. Cars passed. People walked by. The world continued around him, indifferent to his questions. He contacted the few friends from the original investigation who still lived in the area. They were in their 30s now, with lives and families and responsibilities that made the past feel distant. He asked if any of them remembered plans that afternoon, any reason she might have been at that particular corner. They said no, said they'd told the police everything they knew back then, said they wished they could help, but they had nothing to add. One of the friends mentioned that there used to be a payphone at that corner, outside the gas station. She didn't know if it had been there 17 years ago, but she remembered using it once when her cell phone had died. The detective checked old records and confirmed that yes, there had been a payphone there. It had been removed years later, sometime in the mid-2000s when cell phones made them obsolete. He requested phone records for that payphone from the afternoon she disappeared, but the phone company no longer had records going back that far. The detail hung in the air, tantalizing and insufficient. She'd been at that corner. She'd been waiting. And then she hadn't been anywhere at all. The gap between those two facts remained as wide as ever. Her parents turned this new information over in their minds for weeks. They drove to the intersection themselves and stood where their daughter might have stood. They looked down the street in both directions, trying to see what she might have seen, trying to understand what had drawn her there. But the years had changed too much. The gas station had new owners. The vacant lot had been developed. The payphone was gone. Whatever had existed that afternoon had been erased by time. The bus driver read about the case more thoroughly after his call to the police. He looked at the photograph again, studied the face, tried to match it with the memory he had. He thought it might be her. He hoped his recollection had been helpful. But mostly he felt the strange inadequacy of remembering something too late, of carrying a detail for 17 years that might have mattered if he'd mentioned it sooner. And in the house with the aluminum siding, her parents added this fragment to the collection of fragments they'd accumulated over nearly 2 decades. It was something. It was almost nothing. It was a girl standing on a corner in the afternoon sunlight, waiting for someone or something, and then gone. The seasons continue their rotation, indifferent to the questions left hanging in that town. Spring arrives each year and loosens the frozen ground, and summer follows with its long, bright evenings, and autumn comes again with its particular quality of light that makes people remember things they thought they'd forgotten. The leaves turn and fall, and winter settles over everything, and the cycle repeats because that is what cycles do. Her parents are older now in ways that go beyond the simple accumulation of years. Her mother's hands have developed arthritis that makes it difficult to open jars or hold a pen for very long. Her father's hearing has diminished, and sometimes people have to repeat themselves, and he nods as though he's understood, even when he hasn't. They still live in the same house, though they've talked occasionally about selling it, about moving somewhere smaller, somewhere without so many rooms that echo with absence. But they never do. The inertia of grief keeps them there. Her brother visits when he can, brings his wife and eventually his children, small people who run through the house and fill it temporarily with noise and motion. His parents are gentle with the grandchildren, patient in ways they might not have been if their lives had unfolded differently. The children know, in the vague way children know difficult things, that their father had a sister who isn't here anymore. But the knowledge is abstract, a piece of family history without emotional weight. They see the photograph on the mantel, a young woman frozen at 17, and they ask questions that their parents answer carefully, age-appropriately, without detail. The case file sits in a storage room at the police department, boxed and labeled, part of a row of similar boxes containing other unsolved disappearances and deaths. Occasionally someone pulls it out, a new detective reviewing cold cases, a journalist researching a story, a student writing a thesis on missing persons. They read through the documents and find nothing that previous readers haven't already found. The interviews yield no new insights. The timeline remains unchanged. The girl left school and was seen at a corner and then was nowhere. The file goes back into the box and the box goes back onto the shelf. People in town who remember the story think about it sometimes, usually when prompted by something incidental, a news report about a different missing person, a conversation about unsolved mysteries, the sight of a teenage girl walking alone. They feel the appropriate sadness, the appropriate concern, and then they return to their own lives because that is what people do. The ability to move forward is both a blessing and a kind of betrayal, though no one would use that word. The high school has renovated twice since she walked out its doors. The lockers have been replaced, the floors refinished, the walls painted new colors. Students pass through the hallways unaware that someone once left this building and never arrived where she was going. The memory has been absorbed into the institution's long history of small tragedies and large ones, of things that happened and were survived or not survived, of the way time smooths over even the sharpest edges. The shop where she used to work is something else now, a phone repair store or a place that sells vape products, something that didn't exist when she was alive. The building looks the same from outside, but inside, everything has changed. New owners, new inventory, new employees who have never heard her name. The street has changed too. Some businesses have closed, others have opened. The traffic patterns have shifted. Nothing stays the same except in memory, and memory itself is unreliable, subject to erosion and revision. Her parents still think about her every day, though the thoughts have changed texture over the years. The sharp, immediate pain has become something more diffuse, a background ache that colors everything without overwhelming it. They can speak her name without breaking down. They can look at photographs without dissolving. They have learned to carry the weight the way people learn to carry any chronic condition, with resignation and adaptation and occasional moments of acute suffering that pass. Sometimes they dream about her. In the dreams, she is always 17, always exactly as she was, and sometimes she speaks, and sometimes she's silent. And when they wake up, there's a brief, confused moment where they forget that she's gone. And then they remember, and the remembering is its own small death that happens over and over. Her mother has stopped trying to interpret the dreams, stopped looking for messages or signs. They're just the mind's way of processing what it cannot accept. The question of what happened has no answer. It might never have an answer. The girl who walked out of school on an afternoon in September might have gotten into a car with someone she knew or someone she didn't. She might have changed her plans for reasons no one will ever understand. She might have met with some random terrible luck or some intentional terrible harm. The possibilities branch endlessly, and none of them lead anywhere conclusive. Her absence is a permanent condition now, woven into the fabric of her family's existence. It has shaped her brother's life in ways he's only beginning to understand, influenced the kind of partner he chose, the way he parents his own children, the particular quality of sadness he carries that surfaces at unexpected moments. It has defined the final third of her parents' lives, given them a shared experience of loss that is both a bond and an isolation, because no one outside that loss can fully understand its dimensions. And somewhere in the town, or somewhere beyond it, there exists an answer. Someone knows something, or someone once knew something and has forgotten, or the truth is buried in some literal or figurative place where it will never be found. The evidence exists somewhere, in a memory, in a piece of ground, in a connection no one thought to investigate. But whether it will ever surface is a question that has no guarantee attached to it. Time has not healed this wound. Time has only made it older. The phrase people use, that time heals all wounds, is not true, or at least not true in any meaningful sense. Time distances, time dulls, time teaches you to function around the injury. But the wound remains, and on certain days, in certain light, it's as fresh as it ever was. Her parents know they will likely die without knowing what happened to their daughter. They have made a tentative peace with this, the way a person makes peace with a terminal diagnosis, not acceptance exactly, but a recognition of powerlessness, an understanding that some things cannot be changed through will or effort. They have written letters to be opened after their deaths, instructions for what to do with her belongings, requests that the case file remain open, that someone keep looking even when they're gone. And the world continues. The sun rises and sets. People are born and die. Traffic moves through intersections where girls once stood waiting. Buses run their routes. Seasons change. The mechanisms of ordinary life continue their operations, indifferent to the small human stories of loss and longing that occur within them. She was here, and then she wasn't. That is the only certainty. Everything else is speculation and hope. and the terrible patience of waiting for an answer that may never arrive. Her life ended somewhere, somehow, for some reason, and the not knowing is its own kind of death, one that her family endures daily, indefinitely, without relief. The silence where her voice should be has lasted longer now than her voice ever did. The absence has become more substantial than the presence ever was. And still her parents leave the porch light on, a habit they can't break, illuminating nothing but the empty driveway and the street beyond, waiting for someone who will never come home.